Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. It started as an urban legend. Whispers among university students, office workers, and late-night bloggers spoke of an unusual park hidden in the heart of the city. Official maps didn't mark it, and locals avoided discussing it openly. But those who stumbled across it swore something impossible happened there. Time flowed backward. People claimed to have seen leaves rising from the ground to reattach to trees, birds flying in reverse arcs, and footprints on the dirt path vanishing behind walkers. Strangest of all were the stories of people who entered the park and returned speaking of glimpses into their past, forgotten moments, lost loves, or mistakes they wished they could undo. For some, it was a curiosity. For others, it became an obsession. Sophie Ward had never believed in urban legends. As a journalist for a small-town magazine, she prided herself on facts and hard evidence. But when her editor assigned her to investigate the backward park, she couldn't resist. The idea was too ridiculous to ignore, yet something about the story pulled at her. Her research revealed vague hints about the park's location. Somewhere near the older part of town, past streets lined with crumbling Victorian homes and overgrown gardens. She found blurry photos online, trees standing unnaturally still, a pond with ripples moving inward instead of outward. It all seemed too perfect to be true. One overcast afternoon, Sophie set out with her camera, a notebook, and a skeptical mind. It didn't take long before she stumbled upon it. The entrance was unassuming, a wrought iron gate rusted with age, partially obscured by ivy. A small wooden sign above the gate read, "Chrysalis Park," in faded letters. Sophie pushed open the creaky gate, her heart racing with anticipation. The moment Sophie stepped into the park, the air felt different, heavier, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. The chirping of birds was absent, replaced by an odd, faint hum. She wandered the winding paths, her sneakers crunching on gravel. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then she noticed the leaves. A gust of wind sent them fluttering from the ground, upward. She froze, her camera clutched tightly as she watched the leaves reattach themselves to branches as if rewinding a film. Her breath hitched. She continued walking, her pulse quickening with every step. By the time she reached the pond at the center of the park, her sense of reality had started to fray. The water rippled inward, creating perfect stillness at its center. Sophie stared at her reflection, watching as droplets of water leaped upward from the surface to rejoin a non-existent rain cloud. Her camera clicked as she captured image after image, though she doubted anyone would believe them. As Sophie ventured deeper, the park began to play tricks on her. She passed a bench where a couple sat, their movements unnaturally smooth, as though played in reverse. The man lifted his arm, his hand retreating from the woman's shoulder, their laughter swallowed into silence. She turned away, her head spinning. Her path led her to a small clearing where a swing set stood, eerily still. But as she approached, the swings began to move, not forward, but backward, as if unseen children were unswinging themselves. The sight chilled her to the bone. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Her name. "Sophie!" She spun around, her heart in her throat. The voice had sounded familiar, achingly so. She called out, but the park only answered with its strange hum. And yet, as she stood there, memories began to surface. Memories she hadn't thought of in years. Her mother's laughter when she was a child, her first heartbreak, the night her father left without saying goodbye. The park wasn't just reversing time, it was dredging up the past. In the park's farthest corner, Sophie found an old stone clock tower, its hands moving backward with a faint grinding noise. The tower was weathered and covered in ivy, but it radiated an undeniable power. Drawn to it, she pushed open its heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. A spiral staircase wound upward, and Sophie climbed it cautiously, each step echoing in reverse, as though the tower itself resisted her presence. At the top, she found a room filled with clocks, antique pocket watches, ornate grandfather clocks, even digital alarm clocks, all ticking backward in perfect unison. At the center of the room stood an old man, his back to her. He wore a long coat, and his hair was a shock of white. When he turned, his face was lined with age, but his eyes sparkled with an unsettling clarity. "You've come to understand," he said simply. "Understand what?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "The park's purpose," he replied. "It shows us what we've lost, what we've forgotten, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it gives us a chance to change." Sophie's mind raced. Change how? "What do you mean?" The old man smiled sadly. "Time flows in one direction for a reason. But here it bends. It's not a gift, Sophie. It's a test." The old man gestured to a small mirror on the table beside him. "Look into it," he said. "See what you've left undone." Hesitant, Sophie stepped forward and gazed into the mirror. At first, she saw only her reflection, but then the image shifted, showing scenes from her past, her teenage years, her first love, the argument with her father the night he left. Her heart ached as she watched herself say words she wished she could take back. She saw the tears in her father's eyes as he walked out the door. "You can go back," the old man said, "but only once, and only at a cost." "What cost?" Sophie whispered. "Your future," he replied. "Every moment you change will alter the path ahead. You won't be the same person you are now." Sophie's hands trembled. The temptation was overwhelming, but so was the fear. She had spent years regretting that night with her father. But could she sacrifice her present for a chance to rewrite the past? The old man stepped aside, revealing a doorway glowing with golden light. "The choice is yours," he said. Sophie stared at the doorway, her heart pounding. Memories of her father flooded her mind, mingling with the life she had built since then. Could she risk losing everything she had now for a chance to fix her mistakes? After what felt like an eternity, she shook her head. "I can't," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I have to live with what I've done." The old man nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Wise, perhaps," he said, "but the pain will remain." "I'll find a way to live with it," Sophie replied. The room began to fade, the clocks slowing their backward march. As Sophie descended the spiral staircase, the park seemed to dissolve around her. When she stepped back through the wrought iron gate, the world outside felt brighter, sharper, as if time itself had reasserted its grip. Sophie never returned to Chrysalis Park, though the memories of that day stayed with her. She wrote about it in her article, though she left out the details of the clock tower and the old man. Most readers dismissed it as fiction, but a few reached out, sharing their own strange experiences with the park. For Sophie, the park became a reminder, not of what she had lost, but of what she still had. Time moved forward, as it always did, and she vowed to make the most of every moment, because she knew better than anyone that some things could never be undone. The small, dimly lit auction house smelled of old wood and mothballs. Collectors and bargain hunters filled the room, their chatter a soft hum. Among them sat Lydia Carver, a historian with a fascination for the mysterious. She wasn't there for antiques or trinkets. She was looking for something unusual, something with a story. The auctioneer's voice droned on as item after item was sold. Just as Lydia's interest began to wane, the next piece was brought out. A small, intricately carved wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case. The dark wood gleamed under the lights, its surface etched with swirling, almost hypnotic patterns. The auctioneer explained its vague provenance. The box had been found in the attic of an abandoned estate, its contents unknown because no one could unlock it. Lydia felt a strange pull toward it, a compulsion she couldn't explain. When bidding began, she raised her paddle without hesitation. By the time the gavel struck, the box was hers. Back in her modest apartment, Lydia placed the box on her desk. She examined it closely, running her fingers over the carvings. They were intricate yet alien, as though they didn't belong to any known culture. The lock was ornate and ancient, but no key had come with the purchase. She tried opening it with a paperclip, then with a hairpin, but the lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the box. That was when she heard it, a faint whisper. She froze. The sound was soft, barely audible, as if someone were speaking from the other side of a wall. "Help me!" Lydia's heart raced. She leaned closer, placing her ear near the box. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me! Find the key!" Her rational mind told her it was impossible. Objects didn't whisper, and yet there it was, a voice emanating from the sealed box. Lydia's life quickly became consumed by the mystery of the box. She reached out to antique dealers, locksmiths, and historians, hoping to find someone who could help her open it. Most dismissed her, saying the lock was likely decorative or too fragile to tamper with. One dealer, however, seemed intrigued. An older man named Elias, with deep-set eyes and a voice like gravel, examined the box and recoiled slightly. "This isn't just an antique," he murmured. "It's older than it looks, and dangerous." "Dangerous?" Lydia asked, skeptical. Elias nodded. "Boxes like this have stories, cursed objects, relics that hold things best left untouched. I've heard whispers, no pun intended, about items that speak. They reveal truths no one wants to know." Despite his warning, Elias provided a lead, an estate sale catalog from decades ago, listing the box among other artifacts. The original owner had been a collector of oddities rumored to dabble in the occult. Following Elias's lead, Lydia tracked down the estate's records. The collector, a man named Ambrose Wren, had been notorious in his time for hosting seances and collecting supernatural artifacts. His death had been mysterious, found in his study with no sign of trauma, yet his face frozen in terror. Digging deeper, Lydia uncovered a journal written by one of Wren's housekeepers. It mentioned the box, referring to it as the Whispering Vessel. According to the journal, Wren claimed the box contained the voices of those who had taken their secrets to the grave. He believed the box could unlock their knowledge, but at a price. The journal also mentioned a key crafted from a rare black metal, hidden somewhere within Wren's estate. The estate had long been demolished, replaced by a block of sterile office buildings. But the journal hinted that Wren, fearing grave robbers, had hidden the key in a secret compartment of his favorite writing desk. The desk, it turned out, was part of a private collection owned by a reclusive millionaire named Victor Hale. Lydia contacted Hale, explaining her research. Intrigued by her story, he agreed to let her examine the desk under supervision. When she arrived at his sprawling estate, she felt like she'd stepped into a Gothic novel. Dark halls, antique furniture, and a suffocating air of mystery. With Hale watching, Lydia searched the desk and found it, a hidden drawer containing a small black key that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Back in her apartment, Lydia inserted the key into the box's lock, her hands trembling. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping voices, urging her forward. As the key turned, the lock clicked, and the lid sprang open. Inside was a collection of small, yellowed slips of paper, each scrawled with a name. Beneath them lay a polished shard of obsidian, its surface unnervingly reflective. The moment she touched the obsidian, the room grew cold, her vision blurred, and suddenly she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She stood in a void, surrounded by shadowy figures, their faces indistinct. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We are the lost," the figures replied in unison. "The keepers of secrets. We whisper the truths no one dares to speak." The figures explained the box's purpose. It collected the final secrets of the dead, truths they could not take with them to the grave. Anyone who opened the box could learn these secrets, but each revelation came at a cost. The more one learned, the more the box would demand. Fragments of memory, pieces of the soul. Lydia was given a choice: close the box and walk away, or keep it open and learn the truths hidden within. The temptation was overwhelming. As a historian, she had always craved knowledge, but the warning was clear. Knowledge wasn't free. She hesitated, her mind racing. What if the box held answers to history's greatest mysteries? What if it could reveal the secrets of her own life, her estranged father, her mother's untimely death? Unable to resist, Lydia whispered her first question. "What happened to my father?" The box responded instantly. A chilling voice filled her mind, recounting events she had never known. Her father's abandonment wasn't voluntary. He had been blackmailed, forced to disappear to protect her and her mother. The revelation left Lydia shaken but hungry for more. She asked another question, then another. Each answer brought clarity, but also a strange, gnawing emptiness. She felt her memories shifting, details of her own life growing hazy. By the time she closed the box, she realized she had lost something intangible. Her own secrets, her private thoughts, now belonged to the box. Determined to avoid the box's temptation, Lydia locked it away and resolved never to open it again. But the whispers didn't stop. Late at night, they grew louder, taunting her with truths she had yet to uncover. The box's power began to seep into her dreams, her relationships, her very sense of self. She knew she couldn't keep it forever. It would drive her mad. In the end, she donated the box anonymously to a museum, ensuring it would be locked away and forgotten. But deep down, she knew the box would find another owner, someone else who couldn't resist its whispers. Because secrets, once offered, are impossible to ignore. In the heart of the dense, mist-shrouded woods of Eldermore, there flowed a river unlike any other. Known to the locals as the Whispering River, its waters sparkled unnaturally under the moonlight, gliding in an eerie, unbroken silence. No birds chirped near it, and even the trees seemed to lean away, their gnarled branches casting jagged shadows over the water. It was said that if you stood by the riverbank and listened closely, you would hear whispers, soft, urgent murmurs in a language no one could identify. Some claimed they were the voices of the drowned, while others believed the river was alive, its currents carrying the secrets of the world. For generations, the people of Eldermore avoided the river, teaching their children to stay away from its deceptively serene waters. But for Ivy Harrington, the river was not a source of fear. It was a mystery begging to be solved. Ivy was a folklorist and an outsider, having moved to Eldermore 6 months earlier. She had heard the stories about the Whispering River in the local pub, where wary villagers warned her against venturing too close. But Ivy's curiosity was insatiable. She had spent her life chasing myths and uncovering the truth behind legends, and the river seemed like the perfect puzzle. Late one evening, armed with a notebook, a recording device, and her nerves of steel, Ivy ventured to the riverbank. The air grew colder as she approached, and the usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, faded into an oppressive silence. Standing at the edge of the water, Ivy strained her ears. At first, there was nothing but the gentle lapping of the current. Then, as the moon emerged from behind a cloud, she heard it, faint, fragmented whispers, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. Her pulse quickened. She turned on her recorder, leaning closer to the water. "Who's there?" Ivy whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't one voice, but many, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate. "I can't understand you," she said, her breath fogging in the cold air. "What do you want?" For a moment, the whispers fell silent. Then a single voice emerged, clear and chilling. "Help us." Ivy stumbled back, nearly dropping her recorder. The voice was neither male nor female, young nor old. It was otherworldly, resonating in her mind as much as in her ears. "Help you how?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Listen," the voice replied. Over the next few nights, Ivy returned to the river, determined to understand the whispers. She spent hours recording the sounds, analyzing them for patterns or clues. The whispers always grew louder when she spoke to the river, as if it could hear her. One night she brought a hydrophone, lowering it into the water. What she heard chilled her to the bone. Beneath the surface, the whispers were clearer, more coherent. They spoke of betrayal, of injustice, of lives cut short. "They took everything," one voice said. "Forgotten, buried," another murmured. "Bring us back." Ivy began to piece together a narrative. The whispers spoke of a tragedy, an entire village that had been swallowed by the river centuries ago. According to their fragmented accounts, the villagers had been betrayed by their leader, lured to the water under false pretenses, and drowned. Ivy's research led her to old maps and records in the Eldermore Library. To her astonishment, she discovered mentions of a village called Windmere that had stood near the river until the 1600s. According to the records, the village had been abandoned after a flood, but there were no details about what had happened to its people. Digging deeper, Ivy found a journal written by a merchant who had passed through Windmere shortly before its disappearance. The journal hinted at a dark secret. The village had been a site of conflict, its leader accused of selling out his people to a rival lord. The flood, the merchant suggested, had not been natural. It had been orchestrated. Ivy realized the whispers were the voices of Windmere's dead, trapped in the river for centuries, unable to move on. The next time Ivy visited the river, she addressed the spirits directly. "I know who you are," she said, her voice steady despite the chill creeping up her spine. "I know what happened to you, but I don't know how to help." The whispers swirled around her, more urgent than ever. Then the same clear voice from her first visit spoke again. "Find him." "Who?" Ivy asked. "The betrayer." The spirits revealed that their leader, the man responsible for their deaths, had escaped justice. His descendants still lived, unaware of the curse that bound their ancestors' victims to the river. Ivy's investigation led her to a man named Henry Wren, a prominent businessman who owned much of the land around Eldermore. Wren was a direct descendant of Windmere's leader, though he had no knowledge of the village's dark history. When Ivy confronted him, Wren was dismissive, laughing off her claims. But when she played the recordings of the whispers, his face turned pale. This is insane," he stammered. "How do you expect me to fix something that happened centuries ago?" "The spirits want acknowledgement," Ivy said. "They want you to take responsibility for your ancestors' actions. They need closure." Reluctantly, Wren agreed to accompany Ivy to the river. Under the full moon, Ivy and Wren stood at the riverbank. Ivy had researched old cleansing rituals, combining elements from various traditions to create a ceremony that might appease the spirits. Wren read a statement of apology, his voice trembling as he acknowledged his ancestors' betrayal and asked for forgiveness. As the words echoed across the water, the river grew eerily still. The whispers rose in a deafening chorus, then fell silent. The air grew warmer, and for the first time, Ivy felt a sense of peace emanating from the river. The next morning, Ivy returned to the river. For the first time, there were no whispers. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a serene stillness. Word of what had happened spread through Eldermore, and the villagers began to see the river differently, not as a source of fear, but as a place of remembrance. A small memorial was erected on the bank, honoring the lost souls of Windermere. Ivy, though forever changed by her experience, moved on to her next mystery, but she knew she would never forget the whispering river and the voices that had called out to her from its depths. In the heart of the old city of Ravenshire, nestled between crumbling cobblestone streets and weathered buildings, stood the Majestic Theater. Once a beacon of art and culture, the Majestic had fallen into decay after a string of mysterious tragedies in the 1920s. Performers who graced its stage were said to never leave, their spirits bound to the theater. Locals whispered about eerie sounds emanating from the building at night, echoes of applause, muffled lines of dialogue, and the faint strains of a phantom orchestra. Though the theater had been abandoned for nearly a century, its doors remained locked, as if guarding secrets too dark to reveal. For Olivia Chambers, a determined historian and playwright, the Majestic Theater was an irresistible challenge. Drawn by its history and the haunting tales surrounding it, she was determined to uncover the truth about the cursed stage. Olivia arrived at the theater on a foggy autumn morning, armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and her camera. Pushing open the heavy rusted doors, she was greeted by a chilling draft that carried the scent of dust and decay. The grand chandelier that once dazzled audiences hung precariously from the ceiling, its crystals dull and tarnished. The silence inside was oppressive, broken only by the creak of her footsteps. The rows of seats faced the stage like hollow eyes, and the crimson curtains hung in tatters. But the stage itself looked untouched, as if frozen in time. As Olivia stepped closer, she noticed faint footprints in the dust, leading from the stage to the wings. Her pulse quickened. Someone, or something, had been here. While inspecting the stage, Olivia felt a sudden drop in temperature. The air grew heavy, and the dim light streaming through the cracked windows flickered. Then, without warning, the stage lights blazed to life. Olivia stumbled back as a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a tattered tuxedo, his face pale and gaunt. He stepped forward, reciting lines from an old play, his voice echoing through the empty theater. "Who are you?" Olivia called out, her voice shaking. The man stopped mid-monologue and turned to her, his eyes hollow. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. Before she could respond, more figures appeared, women in glittering gowns, men in tailored suits. Their expressions vacant yet desperate. They moved across the stage, performing a scene from an old tragedy. Over the next few days, Olivia returned to the theater, piecing together the history of the Majestic. She discovered that in 1923, during a production of The King's Betrayal, a fire had broken out, trapping the cast and audience inside. Though the fire consumed the backstage area, the stage itself remained untouched. The cast had perished, but locals reported seeing ghostly figures in the theater soon after. It was said that the actors were cursed to perform the same play for eternity, unable to leave until their story was finished. But the tragedy of The King's Betrayal was unique. It ended in unresolved conflict, its final scene rewritten countless times before the fire. They're stuck, Olivia realized. They never finished the play. Determined to free the trapped spirits, Olivia decided to help them complete their performance. She brought old scripts and props, setting them on the stage. Each night, she watched as the actors performed the same scenes, their movements fluid but mechanical. But one night, the lead actor, Victor Moreau, broke character. He turned to Olivia, his expression filled with sorrow. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not just the play, it's the betrayal." "What betrayal?" Olivia asked. Victor hesitated, then gestured toward the wings. "Find the director. He's the one who trapped us here." Olivia's research led her to uncover the name of the play's director, Elias Crown. Elias had been a visionary, but also a tyrant, known for pushing his actors to their limits. On the night of the fire, witnesses claimed Elias had locked the stage doors, insisting the cast perform despite the rising flames. Elias had vanished after the fire, and his body was never found. Some believed he had orchestrated the tragedy, sacrificing his cast in a twisted attempt to achieve artistic immortality. Late one night, as Olivia explored the backstage area, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw a shadowy figure lurking in the wings. "You've been meddling," a deep voice growled. It was Elias. Elias's ghost was more tangible than the others, his form darker and more menacing. He revealed that he had bound the cast's souls to the theater, believing their eternal performance would make his name legendary. "You'll never free them," Elias sneered. "Their fate is sealed." But Olivia refused to give up. She confronted Elias with the truth of his cruelty, reciting the story she had uncovered. The ghostly cast began to gather behind her, their expressions fierce. "You betrayed us, Elias," Victor said, stepping forward. "And now, it's time for you to face justice." The cast surged toward Elias, their spectral forms glowing with an unearthly light. As the spirits confronted their tormentor, the theater shook. The stage lights flickered wildly, and a deafening roar filled the air. Elias's shadowy form dissolved into wisps of smoke, and the cast let out a collective sigh of relief. Victor turned to Olivia, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said. "You've given us a chance to rest." The cast took their places on the stage one last time, performing the final scene of the king's betrayal. As the curtain fell, their forms faded into the ether, leaving the theater eerily quiet. The next morning, Olivia returned to the Majestic. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. The stage was empty, the whispers silenced. She decided to restore the theater, turning it into a museum dedicated to the performers who had lost their lives. The Majestic Theater became a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of art. Though the spirits were gone, Olivia sometimes felt their presence, a faint applause echoing through the halls, as if thanking her for bringing their final act to a close. In a quiet town nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont, there stood a house that had been untouched for decades. The abandoned residence, once home to the enigmatic Whitlock family, was known for its eerie charm. Ivy clung to the crumbling walls, and the windows were shrouded in a perpetual layer of grime. No one had dared to enter the house for years, until the day Charlotte Whitlock returned. Charlotte, a young music historian and the last living member of the Whitlock line, had inherited the house after her father's passing. She arrived with a mix of trepidation and curiosity, intent on uncovering the secrets her family had left behind. While exploring the attic, she stumbled upon a peculiar object buried beneath layers of dust and cobwebs, a small, ornate music box. Its design was otherworldly. Intricate carvings of unfamiliar constellations adorned its wooden frame, and the crank was made of a shimmering metal she couldn't identify. Curiosity outweighed caution, and Charlotte carefully wound the box. When the first notes began to play, her breath caught in her throat. The melody was unlike anything she had ever heard, haunting and beautiful, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 forgotten stories. That night, Charlotte dreamed of a vast, ethereal landscape. Mist swirled around her feet as she wandered through a field of silver grass. In the distance, she heard the same haunting melody from the music box, played on an unseen instrument. Following the sound, she came upon a shimmering lake, its surface reflecting a sky filled with stars she didn't recognize. When she awoke, the melody lingered in her mind. It was as if the music box had transported her to another world. Determined to learn more, Charlotte began researching her family's history. She discovered that the Whitlocks were known for their interest in the arcane. Her great-great-grandmother, Eleanor Whitlock, was a composer who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Rumors suggested she had been experimenting with music beyond comprehension, claiming it could connect realms. Charlotte couldn't help but wonder, Was the music box one of Eleanor's creations? As the days passed, Charlotte found herself increasingly drawn to the music box. Each time she played it, the melody seemed to evolve, revealing new layers of complexity. She began to notice strange phenomena around the house, whispers in the hallways, fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision, and a faint hum in the air that seemed to resonate with the box's tune. One evening, an old family friend, Mrs. Hargrove, came to visit. Upon seeing the music box, the elderly woman's face turned ashen. "You must get rid of that," Mrs. Hargrove warned, her voice trembling. "That box is cursed. It doesn't belong in this world." Charlotte dismissed the warning as superstition. How could something so beautiful be dangerous? But that night, the melody returned to her dreams. And this time, the ethereal landscape had changed. The silver grass was now ash gray, the lake churned with dark waves, and ghostly figures loomed at the edges of her vision. They whispered in languages she couldn't understand, their voices weaving into the melody. Charlotte became obsessed with the music box. She played it incessantly, each note pulling her further into its mysteries. The more she listened, the more she felt the boundaries between worlds begin to blur. One night, while examining the carvings on the box, she noticed a hidden compartment. Inside was a fragment of parchment covered in faded symbols and cryptic instructions. With the help of her research, she deciphered part of the text. "The melody bridges the veil. Play it thrice beneath the full moon, and the forgotten will awaken." The warnings echoed in her mind, but curiosity consumed her. What were the forgotten? Could they be the spirits of her ancestors, or something far older? On the night of the full moon, Charlotte took the music box to the attic, where the moonlight streamed through a circular window. She placed the box on an old table, wound it tightly, and let the melody play. The air grew thick, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. Shadows danced along the walls, moving in time with the music. When the melody ended, she wound the box again. The second playthrough was even more intense. The shadows coalesced into shapes, and the whispers grew louder, forming a chorus that seemed to speak directly to her. By the third playthrough, the room was no longer the attic. Charlotte found herself standing in the silver field from her dreams. The lake shimmered before her, but its waters were now black as ink. From the surface emerged figures cloaked in flowing garments, their faces obscured by veils. "Who are you?" Charlotte asked, her voice trembling. "We are the Forgotten," one of them replied, their voice resonating like a chord struck on a vast organ. "Eleanor sought us, and now you have found us. You have opened the way." The Forgotten explained that the music box was a relic of their world, a bridge crafted by Eleanor to connect realms. Eleanor's experiments had gone too far, and she had become trapped in the space between worlds. "You must complete what she started," the leader of the Forgotten said. "But beware, the bridge demands a toll." "What toll?" Charlotte asked, her heart racing. The figures did not answer. Instead, they began to fade, leaving her alone in the silver field. When she awoke, she was back in the attic, the music box resting in her hands. In the days that followed, Charlotte noticed changes in herself. Her reflection in the mirror seemed distant, her shadow moved independently, and her memories began to blur. She realized too late what the Forgotten had meant by a toll. The music box was taking her essence, one note at a time. Desperate to undo the damage, Charlotte tried to destroy the box, but it was indestructible. The melody had rooted itself in her mind, playing incessantly, drawing her closer to the Forgotten's world. One final full moon arrived, and Charlotte, now a mere shadow of her former self, played the melody for the last time. The Forgotten reappeared, their forms more solid than before. "Welcome home," they said as the silver field enveloped her. The Whitlock house stands empty once more, but locals say they can sometimes hear faint music drifting from the attic. a haunting melody that seems to call out to those who listen too closely. The music box remains hidden, waiting for its next owner, ready to bridge the worlds once again. The village of Cold Hollow was nestled deep within the mountains, a place where time seemed to stand still. Thick forests surrounded it, and mist clung to the cobblestone streets as if the earth itself breathed in slow, mournful sighs. For centuries, Cold Hollow had been shrouded in rumors, a festival whispered about but never seen, said to be held on the first full moon of the winter solstice. According to local legend, it wasn't a celebration for the living, it was a festival for the dead. The villagers avoided talking about it openly, but everyone knew the signs. The air would grow unnaturally cold, shadows would stretch and writhe under the pale moonlight, and faint music, melancholic and haunting, would echo through the valley. None dared venture out when the festival of the departed was said to occur. But Eliza Harper was not like the others. Eliza, a young woman with a knack for unraveling mysteries, had moved to Cold Hollow from the bustling city. She was a journalist with a taste for the strange and unexplained, and the village's eerie reputation had drawn her like a moth to a flame. The rumors of the festival fascinated her. How could an entire event remain unseen, yet leave such an impression on the villagers? One day, as she sipped coffee at the local inn, an old man approached her table. His face was lined with years of hard winters, and his eyes were sharp, full of warnings unsaid. "You're the curious type, aren't you?" he said, his voice gravelly. Eliza nodded. "I've heard stories about a festival here, one no one talks about." The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some stories are best left untold, young lady. The festival of the departed isn't for the likes of us. It's not a tale to chase, it's a door you don't want to open." But Eliza was undeterred. The festival was exactly the kind of mystery she wanted to uncover. Eliza spent weeks digging through the village's scant records. Most of the history was mundane: farming yields, births and deaths. But there were gaps, odd stretches of time where no records existed. Stranger still, she found faded letters from villagers who described the festival in cryptic terms. The music came like a whisper in the dark. One letter read, "They danced, they laughed, and yet the air reeked of sorrow." The full moon of the winter solstice was days away, and Eliza prepared to stay up that night to see if the legends were true. She ignored the wary glances from the villagers and the muttered prayers of those who saw her gathering supplies. "You shouldn't do this," warned Mary, the innkeeper. "If you see the festival, you might not come back the same." Eliza smiled but didn't reply. The night of the solstice arrived, and the village was silent. Every door and window was shut tight, and not a single lantern lit the streets. Eliza wrapped herself in a heavy coat and ventured out, her breath visible in the icy air. She carried a small notebook, a camera, and a flashlight. At first, the world was still. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath her boots. But as the moon rose higher, a faint melody began to drift through the mist. It was unlike any music she had ever heard, soft, mournful, and strangely hypnotic. Eliza followed the sound, her heart pounding. The mist grew thicker, swirling like a living thing, and the temperature plummeted. Ahead, she saw a flicker of light. When she reached the edge of the forest clearing, she stopped in awe. The clearing had transformed into a grand festival ground, glowing with an otherworldly light. Lanterns hung from invisible strings, casting a silvery radiance over the scene. Figures moved through the clearing, hundreds of them, dressed in clothing from every era imaginable. Eliza's breath caught. These were no ordinary revelers. They were translucent, their forms flickering like candle flames. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty yet filled with a deep sorrow. The music was coming from a spectral band on a raised platform. Violins, cellos, and harps played a haunting waltz. The dead danced in perfect harmony, their movements fluid and dreamlike. Eliza couldn't look away. She felt both terrified and enchanted, as though the music itself was pulling her closer. As she stood frozen, one of the spirits turned toward her. It was a young woman in a Victorian gown, her face strikingly beautiful, but eerily vacant. The ghost glided toward Eliza and extended a hand. "Join us," the woman said, her voice soft and melodic. Eliza hesitated. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't move. The ghost's hand was cold as frost when it touched hers, and suddenly Eliza was pulled into the dance. The world around her shifted. The clearing grew brighter, and the music became overwhelming, filling her mind with memories she didn't recognize. Glimpses of lives long past, laughter and tears that weren't her own. As Eliza danced, she realized she was losing herself. Her reflection in the lantern light grew fainter, her thoughts muddled. The spirits around her began to whisper, their words blending with the music. "This is the cost," the Victorian woman said. "You have seen us. Now you belong to the festival." Panic surged through Eliza. She tried to break away, but her feet wouldn't stop moving. The music consumed her, and the world around her faded into the silvery mist. When the sun rose, the village was quiet once more. The clearing in the forest was empty, the mist gone. Villagers ventured outside cautiously, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the festival. But Eliza Harper was nowhere to be found. Her belongings were later discovered at the inn, her notebook open to a blank page, her camera untouched. The villagers didn't speak of her disappearance, but they knew the truth. The festival of the departed had claimed another guest. Years later, on another winter solstice, a new melody joined the festival's haunting waltz. The spirits danced under the full moon, their numbers larger than before. Among them was a young woman in modern clothing, her face serene and her steps graceful. Eliza had become part of the legend, her curiosity binding her to the festival of the departed for eternity. The small town of Greystone sat nestled in a valley perpetually blanketed by clouds. It was the kind of place where time seemed to crawl, where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth, and where the nights felt longer than they should. But one peculiar night changed everything. It began subtly, on the longest night of the year, the winter solstice. The sun had set at its usual time, the sky painted in streaks of crimson and deep indigo. The townsfolk retreated indoors, lighting fires and turning on lamps to keep the creeping cold at bay. But as the hours passed, something strange happened. Midnight came and went, yet the stars and moon refused to budge from their positions. The night lingered unnaturally, stretching into an endless expanse of darkness. At first, no one noticed. Most people were asleep, blissfully unaware of the passage of time. But for those who stayed awake, insomniacs, night shift workers, and restless souls, the unease grew. Emma Callahan, the town's sole night nurse, was among the first to realize something was wrong. She sat in the dimly lit hospital, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. and hadn't budged for hours. Her patient, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, stirred in his bed. His thin, papery voice broke the silence. "Something's wrong with the night," he muttered, his cloudy eyes staring out the window. "It doesn't want to end." Emma tried to reassure him, but deep down she felt it too. The night was stagnant, unnatural. By morning, or what should have been morning, the truth was undeniable. The sun never rose. The horizon remained shrouded in darkness, the stars frozen in place. Panic began to spread as more people realized the night was unending. At the local diner, a group of townsfolk gathered to discuss the phenomenon. Among them was Daniel Grayson, a local mechanic, and Marcy Quinn, the town's high school science teacher. "This has to be an eclipse or some kind of atmospheric event," Marcy reasoned, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "But how long can it last?" Daniel countered, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "It's been over 12 hours since sunrise should have come." No one had answers, only theories. But something else was happening, something darker. Those who stayed awake began to notice things. By the second day of endless night, those who had resisted sleep started to report strange occurrences. Shadows seemed to move independently, flickering in ways that defied the dim light of lanterns and flashlights. Emma, still at the hospital, noticed the shadows under Mr. Whitaker's bed, shifting unnaturally. She swore she saw them stretch toward him like grasping fingers. "Don't let them take me," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "They come for the ones who don't sleep." The warning sent a chill down Emma's spine. She began to hear faint whispers in the halls, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Meanwhile, Marcy began to piece together a chilling pattern. Through old journals and folklore she found in the town library, she discovered references to a phenomenon called the unbroken night. According to the tales, it was a curse that descended on those who defied the natural order of rest. "The night needs balance," she explained to the diner crowd. "Those who stay awake too long disturb that balance, and something comes to restore it." Her words were met with skepticism, but Emma and a few others believed her. The proof was in the growing reports of disappearances. People who had refused to sleep began to vanish, leaving behind only their shadows etched on the walls or floors, as if burned into existence. On the third day, the whispers became louder for those still awake. They carried promises of rest, of peace, of dreams so sweet they would erase the fear. Daniel, struggling to stay alert, saw his reflection in the window, but the reflection didn't mimic his movements. Instead, it smiled at him, a dark, knowing grin that wasn't his own. "Close your eyes, Daniel," it whispered. "You've been awake too long." The sleepless began to feel the weight of exhaustion crushing them, but they were too terrified to sleep, knowing the shadows waited. By the fifth day of the endless night, only a handful of townsfolk remained awake. Emma, Marcy, Daniel, and a few others barricaded themselves in the hospital, determined to find a way to survive. "We can't stay awake forever," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "What if we, I don't know, fight back somehow?" Emma shook her head. "You can't fight shadows, but maybe we can break the curse." She had found an old note among Marcy's research. "The night ends when balance is restored. Sleep and let the darkness take its due." It was a gamble, but Emma believed the only way to end the endless night was to confront it, by surrendering to sleep. One by one, they agreed to try. Emma was the last to close her eyes, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The moment her eyelids fell, the world shifted. She found herself in a vast, shadowy landscape where the air hummed with an eerie energy. The others were there too, their forms shimmering like faint lights in the darkness. Around them, the shadows coalesced into towering figures with hollow, glowing eyes. "You defied the night," the largest shadow intoned. Its voice was like the groaning of ancient trees. "You must pay the toll." Emma stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "Take what you need, but end this. Let the sun rise again." The shadows paused, then reached out, their inky tendrils brushing against each of the dreamers. Emma felt a deep, soul-aching cold as a part of her was taken. Memories of warmth, of light, of laughter. But the shadows withdrew, satisfied. When Emma woke, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the hospital windows. The endless night had ended. The survivors were forever changed. They carried the weight of the shadow's touch, a lingering emptiness they couldn't explain. But the town of Greystone returned to normal, and the phenomenon became another whispered legend. For Emma, the memory of the shadows and their toll would never fade. She knew the night's hunger could return, and she prayed the balance would never be disturbed again. It started as an urban legend. Whispers among university students, office workers, and late-night bloggers spoke of an unusual park hidden in the heart of the city. Official maps didn't mark it, and locals avoided discussing it openly. But those who stumbled across it swore something impossible happened there. Time flowed backward. People claimed to have seen leaves rising from the ground to reattach to trees, birds flying in reverse arcs, and footprints on the dirt path vanishing behind walkers. Strangest of all were the stories of people who entered the park and returned, speaking of glimpses into their past, forgotten moments, lost loves, or mistakes they wished they could undo. For some, it was a curiosity. For others, it became an obsession. Sophie Ward had never believed in urban legends. As a journalist for a small-town magazine, she prided herself on facts and hard evidence. But when her editor assigned her to investigate the backward park, she couldn't resist. The idea was too ridiculous to ignore, yet something about the story pulled at her. Her research revealed vague hints about the park's location. Somewhere near the older part of town, past streets lined with crumbling Victorian homes and overgrown gardens. She found blurry photos online, trees standing unnaturally still, a pond with ripples moving inward instead of outward. It all seemed too perfect to be true. One overcast afternoon, Sophie set out with her camera, a notebook, and a skeptical mind. It didn't take long before she stumbled upon it. The entrance was unassuming. A wrought iron gate rusted with age, partially obscured by ivy. A small wooden sign above the gate read, "Chrysalis Park," in faded letters. Sophie pushed open the creaky gate, her heart racing with anticipation. The moment Sophie stepped into the park, the air felt different, heavier, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. The chirping of birds was absent, replaced by an odd, faint hum. She wandered the winding paths, her sneakers crunching on gravel. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then she noticed the leaves. A gust of wind sent them fluttering from the ground, upward. She froze, her camera clutched tightly as she watched the leaves reattach themselves to branches, as if rewinding a film. Her breath hitched. She continued walking, her pulse quickening with every step. By the time she reached the pond at the center of the park, her sense of reality had started to fray. The water rippled inward, creating perfect stillness at its center. Sophie stared at her reflection, watching as droplets of water leaped upward from the surface to rejoin a non-existent rain cloud. Her camera clicked as she captured image after image, though she doubted anyone would believe them. As Sophie ventured deeper, the park began to play tricks on her. She passed a bench where a couple sat, their movements unnaturally smooth, as though played in reverse. The man lifted his arm, his hand retreating from the woman's shoulder, their laughter swallowed into silence. She turned away, her head spinning. Her path led her to a small clearing where a swing set stood, eerily still. But as she approached, the swings began to move. Not forward, but backward, as if unseen children were unswinging themselves. The sight chilled her to the bone. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Her name. Sophie! She spun around, her heart in her throat. The voice had sounded familiar, achingly so. She called out, but the park only answered with its strange hum. And yet, as she stood there, memories began to surface. Memories she hadn't thought of in years. Her mother's laughter when she was a child, her first heartbreak, the night her father left without saying goodbye. The park wasn't just reversing time, it was dredging up the past. In the park's farthest corner, Sophie found an old stone clock tower, its hands moving backward with a faint grinding noise. The tower was weathered and covered in ivy, but it radiated an undeniable power. Drawn to it, she pushed open its heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. A spiral staircase wound upward, and Sophie climbed it cautiously, each step echoing in reverse, as though the tower itself resisted her presence. At the top, she found a room filled with clocks, antique pocket watches, ornate grandfather clocks, even digital alarm clocks, all ticking backward in perfect unison. At the center of the room stood an old man, his back to her. He wore a long coat, and his hair was a shock of white. When he turned, his face was lined with age, but his eyes sparkled with an unsettling clarity. "You've come to understand," he said simply. "Understand what?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "The park's purpose," he replied. "It shows us what we've lost, what we've forgotten, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it gives us a chance to change." Sophie's mind raced. "Change how? What do you mean?" The old man smiled sadly. "Time flows in one direction for a reason, but here, it bends. It's not a gift, Sophie. It's a test." The old man gestured to a small mirror on the table beside him. "Look into it," he said. "See what you've left undone." Hesitant, Sophie stepped forward and gazed into the mirror. At first, she saw only her reflection, but then the image shifted, showing scenes from her past, her teenage years, her first love, the argument with her father the night he left. Her heart ached as she watched herself say words she wished she could take back. She saw the tears in her father's eyes as he walked out the door. "You can go back," the old man said, "but only once, and only at a cost." "What cost?" Sophie whispered. "Your future," he replied. "Every moment you change will alter the path ahead. You won't be the same person you are now." Sophie's hands trembled. The temptation was overwhelming, but so was the fear. She had spent years regretting that night with her father. But could she sacrifice her present for a chance to rewrite the past? The old man stepped aside, revealing a doorway glowing with golden light. "The choice is yours," he said. Sophie stared at the doorway, her heart pounding. Memories of her father flooded her mind, mingling with the life she had built since then. Could she risk losing everything she had now for a chance to fix her mistakes? After what felt like an eternity, she shook her head. "I can't," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I have to live with what I've done." The old man nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Wise, perhaps," he said, "but the pain will remain." "I'll find a way to live with it," Sophie replied. The room began to fade, the clocks slowing their backward march. As Sophie descended the spiral staircase, the park seemed to dissolve around her. When she stepped back through the wrought iron gate, the world outside felt brighter, sharper, as if time itself had reasserted its grip. Sophie never returned to Chrysalis Park, though the memories of that day stayed with her. She wrote about it in her article, though she left out the details of the clock tower and the old man. Most readers dismissed it as fiction, but a few reached out, sharing their own strange experiences with the park. For Sophie, the park became a reminder, not of what she had lost, but of what she still had. Time moved forward, as it always did, and she vowed to make the most of every moment. Because she knew, better than anyone, that some things could never be undone. For Cassie Delaney, the new job was a lifeline. After months of unemployment, she had finally landed a position as an administrative assistant at Vanguard Tower, one of the tallest buildings in the city. The skyscraper loomed over downtown, its reflective glass exterior shimmering under the sun, a testament to modernity and power. Cassie's first day was filled with the usual chaos of onboarding, filling out paperwork, meeting co-workers, and learning the layout of the immense building. The office was on the 27th floor, and like most employees, she relied on the sleek, high-speed elevators to navigate the tower. "Stick to elevator C," her manager Mark advised during her tour. "The others have been unreliable lately." Cassie laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. But as the day wore on, she noticed a strange tension among the staff whenever the elevators were mentioned. People avoided them unless absolutely necessary, and even then, they rarely rode alone. It was late when Cassie finished her work that evening. The office had emptied out, and the building's usual hum had quieted to an eerie stillness. She pressed the down button for elevator C and waited, the faint echo of her heels clicking against the marble floor. When the elevator doors slid open, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator began its descent, the hum of machinery steady and predictable. But then with a jolt, it stopped. Cassie frowned and checked the floor indicator above the doors. It read 13. That didn't make sense. Vanguard Tower didn't have a 13th floor. Like many superstitious buildings, it skipped straight from 12 to 14. Before she could process what was happening, the doors slid open. The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the air heavy with a metallic tang. The walls were bare concrete, smeared with what looked like rust, or perhaps something darker. There was no sound, no movement. Yet Cassie felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. She slammed the close doors button, her heart pounding as the elevator doors creaked shut. The car jolted back to life, continuing its descent as if nothing had happened. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, she bolted out, shaking. The next morning, Cassie tried to rationalize what had happened. It had to be a glitch, she told herself, a miscalculation in the system. Still, curiosity nagged at her. During her lunch break, she approached the receptionist, a friendly woman named Jana. "Hey, Jana," Cassie began, keeping her tone light. "Have you ever noticed anything weird about the elevators?" Jana's smile faltered. She glanced around, lowering her voice. "You mean like the non-existent floors?" Cassie froze. "So it's not just me?" Jana sighed, her expression grim. "It's been happening for years. No one knows why. People have reported stopping on floors that aren't supposed to exist. Floors that don't show up on any blueprints. Most of the time, it's the 13th floor. But I've heard stories about others. Floors in the hundreds, floors where time doesn't move the same." "Why doesn't anyone do anything about it?" Cassie asked, horrified. "They've tried. Inspectors, engineers, even priests. Nothing works. Management doesn't like us talking about it. Just avoid riding alone, okay?" A few weeks later, the office buzzed with unease. An employee named Tyler, one of the IT guys, hadn't shown up for work. His phone went straight to voicemail, and no one had seen him since he left the building the previous night. "Maybe he quit," someone suggested. "Without telling anyone?" Another coworker countered. "No way." Cassie couldn't shake the memory of her own experience in the elevator. She asked Jana if Tyler had mentioned anything unusual. Jana hesitated, then nodded. "He told me he stopped on the 13th floor a few days ago. Said he felt like something was trying to pull him out of the elevator. He laughed it off, but he looked terrified." That evening, Cassie found herself working late again. The office was silent, her co-workers long gone. She thought about taking the stairs but dismissed the idea. 27 floors were too many to walk after a long day. She pressed the button for elevator C, dread pooling in her stomach. The doors opened, and she stepped inside, holding her breath. The ride started smoothly, but her heart sank when the car shuddered to a stop. The floor indicator blinked, -1. There was no basement in Vanguard Tower. The doors opened, revealing a corridor bathed in a sickly green light. The walls were lined with old filing cabinets, their drawers slightly ajar. Faint whispers echoed in the distance, growing louder as Cassie stepped closer to the threshold. "Cassie?" Her name drifted through the air, distorted and hollow. She stumbled back, her pulse racing. The elevator doors began to close, and she lunged forward, slamming the open button. But something was in the doorway now. A shadow, tall and indistinct, stood just beyond the threshold. Its outline flickered like static, its face a void of shifting darkness. The whispers grew into a deafening roar as Cassie screamed and hit every button on the control panel. The doors finally shut, the elevator jerking upward with a groan. When it opened again on the 27th floor, she collapsed onto the carpet, sobbing. Cassie didn't return to work the next day. She spent hours researching Vanguard Tower, desperate for answers. Buried in obscure forums and local archives, she found fragmented stories about the building's construction. Workers had reported strange accidents during its early days: fatal falls, sudden disappearances, tools vanishing without explanation. One article mentioned a construction foreman who had died on site. His body was found mangled in an elevator shaft, though no one could explain how he had fallen. Some say he never left, the article concluded. Determined to put an end to the terror, Cassie returned to the building after hours. She carried a flashlight, a notebook, and a small vial of holy water, just in case. She stepped into elevator C, her heart hammering in her chest. "Take me to the 13th floor," she whispered. The elevator shuddered, descending. The floor indicator flickered wildly before settling on 13. The doors opened, and Cassie stepped out. The hallway was as she remembered, dark, metallic, and wrong. But this time she didn't retreat. She walked forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. At the end of the hallway, she found a door marked "Maintenance." Inside, the air was freezing, her breath visible in the dim light. A figure stood in the corner, a man wearing a hard hat, his body contorted unnaturally. His eyes glowed faintly, fixed on Cassie. "Leave," he rasped, his voice echoing, "or you'll never return." Cassie stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for the elevator, the whispers now a cacophony around her. When she finally reached the car and pressed the closed doors button, the shadowy figure lunged toward her. The doors shut just in time, and the elevator shot upward, faster than it ever had before. When it opened again on the ground floor, she ran out, vowing never to return. Cassie quit her job at Vanguard Tower and moved to a different city, far away from skyscrapers and their haunting elevators. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of that shadowy figure and the whispers that followed her. And somewhere in Vanguard Tower, Elevator C still stops on floors that don't exist, waiting for its next passenger. It began on an unremarkable autumn evening in the quiet town of Evergrove. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets and golden leaf trees. Lila Marston, a young artist with a penchant for sketching in the twilight, sat on a bench in the town's central park. Her sketchbook rested on her lap, her charcoal pencil moving swiftly across the page. The park was nearly deserted, save for the occasional jogger or dog walker. But as the sun dipped lower, Lila noticed something unusual. A shadow stretched across the pavement in front of her, not cast by her or the nearby lampposts. It was too large, too fluid, and moved as if it had a will of its own. She looked around, expecting to see someone nearby. The path was empty. The shadow had no owner. Her chest tightened. She quickly packed her things and left, convincing herself it was a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But as she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was following her. That night, Lila tried to sleep, but the unease lingered. The sound of rustling leaves outside her window felt louder, more deliberate. At one point, she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the corner of her bedroom, a faint outline darker than the surrounding shadows. The next morning, she found smudged charcoal marks on her sketchbook, though she was certain she hadn't touched it since the park. Her latest drawing, a serene depiction of the park bench, now featured a strange shadow stretching across the page, dark and distorted. "Maybe I drew it without realizing," she murmured. But even as she said it, she didn't believe herself. Lila wasn't the only one noticing strange occurrences in Evergrove. At the local coffee shop, snippets of conversation floated around about eerie shadows appearing in the most unexpected places. On ceilings where no light could cast them, in reflections, or following people home at night. Mrs. Thorne, the elderly librarian, swore she saw a shadow lingering near her shelves long after closing. "It moved even though nothing was there," she whispered to anyone who would listen. A young boy claimed his own shadow had disappeared for hours, replaced by one that was too tall and didn't move the way it should. Leela listened, her heart racing. She kept quiet about her own experience but started paying closer attention. Days turned into weeks, and Lila couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. The shadow appeared often now, on the walls of her apartment, stretching unnaturally or lingering in corners where light should have erased it. It never moved when she stared directly at it, but in her peripheral vision, it seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. One evening, she decided to confront it. Armed with a flashlight, she waited in her living room, the lights dimmed. Hours passed in tense silence until finally the shadow emerged, pooling on the floor near her bookshelf. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The shadow didn't respond, but as she shone the flashlight toward it, the beam seemed to bend, absorbed into the darkness. Her heart pounded as she realized the shadow wasn't merely a trick of the light, it was something alive. Desperate for answers, Lila visited Mrs. Thorne at the library. The elderly woman, known for her knowledge of the town's history, listened intently to Lila's story before nodding gravely. "There's an old tale," Mrs. Thorne said, pulling a dusty book from the archives, "about a shadow that doesn't belong to anyone. It's said to be the remnant of someone who lost their soul, a punishment for a deal gone wrong or a terrible sin. This shadow roams seeking a new master. It latches onto those it finds suitable." "Suitable for what?" Lila asked, dread creeping into her voice. "For taking its place." Mrs. Thorne gave Lila a grim warning. "The longer it stays with you, the stronger its hold becomes. You mustn't let it consume you. Shadows thrive on fear, guilt, and regret." Layla tried to follow the advice to ignore the shadow and live her life as normally as possible. But it was impossible to escape. It grew bolder, appearing in broad daylight, slithering across walls and floors like a living entity. Sometimes it mimicked her movements, other times it didn't. One night, she woke to find it hovering over her, a formless mass of darkness with no discernible features. But she felt its intent, a hunger, a yearning to take her place in the world. Lila decided to confront the shadow one last time. She returned to the park where she had first seen it, carrying nothing but her sketchbook and a lantern. The park was eerily quiet, the trees swaying in a wind she couldn't feel. The shadow appeared almost instantly, pooling at her feet. This time it moved deliberately, forming a vague humanoid shape. A faint whisper echoed in the air, words she couldn't understand. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice breaking. The shadow reached toward her sketchbook. Pages flipped wildly until it stopped on the first drawing, the one with the distorted shadow. Slowly it pointed at her signature at the bottom of the page. "My name?" she asked, confused. "Why?" The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Then she understood. It wanted her identity, her existence. If she gave it her name, it would take her place in the world, leaving her trapped in its shadowy void. Lila knew she couldn't outrun the shadow. It had grown too strong, its presence an inescapable weight. But she wasn't ready to lose herself, to let the shadow win. She picked up her pencil and began to draw furiously in her sketchbook. The shadow hesitated, watching as she sketched a figure, a dark, featureless being, surrounded by light. "This is you," she whispered, her voice steady. "But you don't have to take me. I'll give you a form, an existence of your own." The shadow seemed to shiver, its edges flickering like a flame. Slowly it leaned into the page, merging with the drawing. Lila kept sketching, pouring every ounce of her will into the image, until the shadow was fully contained within the paper. The next morning, Lila awoke to find the shadow gone. The sketchbook lay on her desk, open to the page where the shadow's figure remained, now motionless and still. She felt a strange sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. She locked the sketchbook away, vowing never to open it again. But sometimes in the dead of night, she swore she could hear faint whispers coming from the drawer where it was hidden, a reminder that the shadow, though imprisoned, was still watching and waiting. The house at the end of Maple Lane had been abandoned for decades. No one in the small town of Eldermere dared approach it. The stories of strange occurrences and whispered legends had ensured that it remained untouched. Yet when Claire Evans inherited the property from a distant relative she'd never met, she saw it as an opportunity to escape her small apartment in the city. "It's just an old house," she told herself as she drove up the overgrown driveway. The two-story Victorian loomed above her, its peeling paint and broken shutters casting eerie shadows in the late afternoon sun. Inside, the house was a time capsule. Dust-covered furniture, antique knickknacks, and faded wallpaper told of a life long abandoned. But it was the bay window in the upstairs study that immediately caught Claire's attention. The glass was pristine, untouched by dust or grime, and it gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. The frame was intricately carved with symbols Claire couldn't identify. She peered through it, expecting to see the unkempt garden below, but instead she saw something entirely different. The world beyond the window was lush and vibrant. Towering trees with silver leaves stretched toward a sky painted in swirling hues of gold and violet. Strange bird-like creatures with iridescent feathers flitted between the branches. It was breathtaking and impossible. Claire spent hours staring through the window, unable to tear herself away. The scene beyond was alive, as if she were watching a real place rather than a painted landscape. Occasionally, she thought she saw figures moving in the distance, humanoid shapes darting between the trees. The next day, she tried opening the window, but it wouldn't budge. She tapped on the glass, and it felt solid, ordinary, yet the world beyond remained vivid and surreal. Determined to understand, Claire began researching. She scoured the house for clues and eventually found a journal tucked inside a drawer in the study. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Morley, her distant relative and the house's previous owner. In his meticulous handwriting, Elias described the window as a gateway. He had spent years studying it, convinced it wasn't just a portal to another world, but a two-way connection. That night, Claire dreamed of the world beyond the window. She walked through its forest, the soft glow of bioluminescent plants lighting her path. In the distance, she saw a figure standing beneath a massive tree. The figure raised a hand as if beckoning her closer, but before she could reach them, she woke up. The next morning, something was different. A faint smear marred the pristine glass of the window, a handprint, though it wasn't hers. Claire's heart raced. Was something trying to communicate with her? She placed her own hand against the glass, aligning it with the print, and felt a strange warmth. The colors in the window swirled and shifted, and for a moment she thought she heard whispers. She grabbed Elias's journal and flipped to the last entry, which read, "They are calling to me. I cannot ignore them any longer. If you are reading this, know that the window is not a blessing. It is a test." Claire couldn't ignore the pull of the window. It dominated her thoughts, consuming her every waking moment. Finally, she decided to see if the gateway could be activated. Following Elias's notes, she placed a series of objects on the windowsill: a silver coin, a feather, and a small vial of water. The moment she arranged them, the glass shimmered like water. She reached out cautiously, and her hand passed through the glass, as though it were a liquid veil. Heart pounding, Claire stepped through. The air on the other side was thick and sweet, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and rich earth. The world was even more vibrant up close. She marveled at the towering trees and glowing rivers, but the beauty was tempered by a sense of unease. In the distance, she saw figures. They were tall and ethereal, with elongated limbs and luminous eyes. They watched her in silence. The beings approached slowly, their movements fluid and deliberate. One stepped forward and spoke in a language Claire couldn't understand, yet somehow the meaning was clear. You should not be here. Claire tried to explain that the window had drawn her, that she didn't mean to intrude. The being tilted its head. The window is a bridge, but it is not meant for your kind. Then why does it exist? She asked. To tempt, the being replied. To test. Many have come before you, drawn by curiosity, but none have returned unchanged. The words sent a chill down Claire's spine. The beings led her to a massive tree with roots that seemed to pulse with life. Beneath it, she saw countless objects, watches, jewelry, books, and more. Each item radiated a faint energy. These are the remnants of those who came before, one being explained. They left pieces of themselves behind, willingly or not. The window feeds on what it takes. What did it take from them? Claire asked. Their memories, their hopes. Their souls, Claire stumbled back, horrified. I didn't agree to this. You did the moment you crossed, the being said, but you have a choice. Leave now, and the window will close to you forever. Stay, and you may find what you seek, but at great cost. Claire was torn. The world beyond the window was mesmerizing, but the being's warnings echoed in her mind. If she stayed, what would she lose? Could she truly risk it? The beings watched her silently as she wrestled with her decision. Finally, she turned back toward the shimmering portal. I can't stay, she said. The beings nodded solemnly. Then go and do not return. The window's temptations grow stronger each time it is crossed. Claire stepped through the portal, back into the dusty study. She turned to look at the window, but the vibrant world was gone. All she saw was her reflection in the glass. For days after, Claire felt a strange emptiness. She couldn't remember certain parts of her life, fragments of her childhood, the faces of old friends. It was as if pieces of her had been plucked away. The window remained silent, its surface dull and lifeless. Yet at night, Claire dreamed of the world beyond. She dreamed of the beings and their luminous eyes, of the endless forest and its secrets. And sometimes, just before she woke, she heard whispers. The window waits.